One Summer Night by Ambrose Bierce. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One Summer Night by Ambrose Bierce. The fact that Henry Armstrong was buried did not seem to him to prove that he was dead. He had always been a hard man to convince. That he really was buried, the testimony of his senses compelled him to admit. His posture, flat upon his back with his hands crossed upon his stomach, and tied with something that he easily broke without profitably altering the situation, the strict confinement of his entire person. The black darkness and profound silence made a body of evidence impossible to controvert, and he accepted it without cavil. But dead? No, he was only very, very ill. He had, withal, the invalid's apathy and did not greatly concern himself about the uncommon fate that had been allotted to him. No philosopher was he, just a plain, commonplace person gifted, for the time being, with a pathological indifference. The organ that he feared consequences with was torpid. So, with no particular apprehension for his immediate future, he fell asleep, and all was peace with Henry Armstrong. But something was going on overhead. It was a dark summer night, shot through with infrequent shimmers of lightning, silently firing a cloud lying low in the west and portending a storm. These brief, stammering illuminations brought out with ghastly distinctness the monuments and headstones of the cemetery and seemed to set them dancing. It was not a night in which any credible witness was likely to be straying about a cemetery, so the three men who were there, digging into the grave of Henry Armstrong, felt reasonably secure. Two of them were young students from a medical college a few miles away. The third was a gigantic Negro known as Jess. For many years, Jess had been employed about the cemetery as a man-of-all-work, and it was his favorite pleasantry that he knew every soul in the place. From the nature of what he was now doing, it was inferable that the place was not so populous as its register may have shown it to be. Outside the wall, at the part of the grounds farthest from the public road, were a horse and a light wagon waiting. The work of excavation was not difficult. The earth with which the grave had been loosely filled a few hours before offered little resistance and was soon thrown out. Removal of the casket from its box was less easy, but it was taken out, for it was a prerequisite of Jess, who carefully unscrewed the cover and laid it aside, exposing the body in black trousers and white shirt. At that instant, the air sprang to flame. A cracking shock of thunder shook the stunned world, and Henry Armstrong tranquilly sat up. With inarticulate cries, the men fled in terror, each in a different direction, for nothing on earth could two of them have been persuaded to return. But Jess was of another breed. In the gray of the morning, the two students, pallid and haggard from anxiety, and with the terror of their adventure still beating tumultuously in their blood, met at the medical college. "You saw it?" cried one. "God, yes! What are we to do?" They went around to the rear of the building, where they saw a horse, attached to a light wagon, hitched to a gate-post near the door of the dissecting room. Mechanically they entered the room. On a bench in the obscurity sat the Negro Jess. He rose, grinning, all eyes and teeth. "I'm waiting for my pay," he said. Stretched naked on a long table lay the body of Henry Armstrong, the head defiled with blood and clay from a blow with a spade. End of One Summer Night by Ambrose Bierce. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.
Number 13 by M.R. James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shant Alajajan. Number 13 by M.R. James. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks. Near it is Hald, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by is Fenderup, where Mark Stig murdered King Eric Glipping on St. Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Eric's skull when his tomb was opened in the 17th century. But I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Priestlers and the Phoenix are all that can be desired. But my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will, perhaps, explain the reason of his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, the Sogne Kirke, the Radhuis, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house. That is, the front is of brick, with corby steps on the gables and a text over the door, but the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business in the ordinary sense of the word that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that in the Riksarkiv of Viborg there were papers, saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps as much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at 1 or 2 of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after the day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required, but on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favor of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and that it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light and the pretty view would more than compensate him for the additional amount of noise. Eventually number 12 was selected. Like its neighbors, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast iron erection, on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription, I Bog Mose, Cap 22, above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only interesting picture was an old colored print of the town, date about 1820. Supper time was approaching, and when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the numbers of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or sagfører, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tale of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed 6 times in his experience of Danish hotels. He could not help wondering whether the objection to that particular number, common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me. I am giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books, and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock he resolved to go to bed, but with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print, and he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train, and which alone would satisfy him at that present moment, was in the pocket of his great-coat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining-room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and, as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So, at least, he thought. But when he arrived there, and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he got the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes, had read his wonted 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light, and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that, whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he had not chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks and liked it very much. But probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own. And he looked drowsily about the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in a dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Andersen attacked the Rigsarkiv of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had at all anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jorgen Fries, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him, in the town. Its tenant was apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. He practiced secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish church that such a viper and blood-sucking trollman should be patronized and harbored by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Mag Nicholas Franken if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Andersen had not time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader, Rasmus Nielsen, before the record office was closed for the day. But he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decisions of bishops of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not and could not be a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Andersen was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Andersen had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Andersen spoke of embodying their contents. "The house of the Bishop Fries," he added. "It is a great puzzle to me where it can have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of old Viborg, but it is most unlucky. Of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the greater part of the archive, just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind, perhaps I shall some day succeed to find him." After taking some exercise, I forgot exactly how or where, Anderson went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel board, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside it, for as he neared the door he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick hissing breathing as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. If he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket handkerchief, out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of a theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happen in Denmark, but some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the stupid must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort that he could not wait till the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite, with large spaces of dead wall, no passers-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall opposite. Also the shadow of the bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. Also the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the window-sill, looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man. Or was it by any chance a woman? At least, it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and, he thought, must be possessed of a red lampshade. The lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distinct playing up and down of a dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white, material on the window-sill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position, for very swiftly and suddenly he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Anderson, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the window-sill and went to bed. Next morning he was awoken by the stupage with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How could it possibly have escaped him the night before? He did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than the portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant with his choice after all had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed. And here was his cigarette end on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast. rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots still outside his door, a gentleman's boots. So then number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his eyes or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found which referred to the affair of Mag Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jorgen Frist Rasmussen Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared if need be to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, yet forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Mag Nicholson Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, have been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this time falls. But forasmuch as you further allege that the apostle and evangelist St. John in his heavenly apocalypse describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you, etc." Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly, and as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon he paid a short visit to Hald, and took his tea at Bakulund, nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication of such a failure of eye or brain as his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper he found himself next to the landlord. "What," he asked him after some indifferent conversation, "is the reason why in most of the hotels one visits in this country the number 13 is left out of the list of rooms? I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think that you should have noticed a thing like that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now this many years. A fine, upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys, one snowy day—" Here he plunged into reminiscence. "Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having a number 13? said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in our house first, and then when we were born he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house." Then followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. "And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travelers, are what we have to provide for in general. And put them in number 13? Why, they'd as soon sleep in the street, or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them, but they stick to it that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men that have slept in a number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing and another," said the landlord, after searching for a more graphic phrase. "Then what do you use your number 13 for?" said Anderson, conscious as he said the words of a curious anxiety quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. "My number 13? Why, don't I tell you that there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room." "Well, yes. Only I happened to think, that is, I fancied last night that I'd seen a door number 13 in that passage, and really I am almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it the night before as well." Of course, Herr Christensen laughed this notion to scorn, as Andersen had expected, and emphasized with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed or had existed before him in that hotel. Andersen was in some ways relieved by his certainty, but still puzzled, and began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficient good excuse. Herr Christensen was flattered by the invitation and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock he was to make his appearance, but before that Andersen had some letters to write, and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13, so much so that he approached his room by way of number 11, in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door, or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing, beyond that indefinable air of being smaller than usual, to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind, and sat down to his writing. His neighbours were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage, and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walking past humming to himself, and outside from time to time a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Andersen finished his letters, ordered in whiskey and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man, who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Sagfører annehaviland, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in a hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for a historical painting in the grand style. And Andersen's thoughts, like those of Emily in the Mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them. But when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor. And even if my neighbors swore, I'd go on dancing all the more, for I'm acquainted with the law, and in despite of all their jaw, their protests I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Andersen had been, by something unusual in its aspect. But he made no remark. Andersen's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment begun to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down with a despairing moan, as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Andersen felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge in society to some neighbor bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. "I don't understand it," he said at last, wiping his forehead. "It is dreadful. I have heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat." "Is he mad?" said Andersen. "He must be, and what a sad thing. Such a good customer, too, and so successful in his business, by what I hear, and a young family to bring up." Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered, without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer, in dishabille, and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. "I beg pardon, sir," he said, "but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist." Here he stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull it swelled forth again more wildly than before. "But what in the name of heaven does it mean?" broke out the lawyer. "Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind?" "Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in the chimney?" This was the best that occurred to Andersen to say, and he realized its futility as he spoke. But anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad, white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering as he clutched the arms of his chair. "Impossible," said the lawyer. "Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the next room to mine." "Was there no door between yours and mine?" said Andersen eagerly. "No, sir," said Jensen, rather sharply. "At least, not this morning." "Ah," said Andersen, "nor tonight?" "I am not sure," said the lawyer, with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. "Come," said the lawyer. "What have you to say, Herr Christensen? What does this mean?" "Good heavens," said Christensen, "how should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again." "So do I," said Herr Jensen, and he added something under his breath. Andersen thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, "Omnis spiritus laudet Dominum," but he could not be sure. "But we must do something," said Andersen. "The three of us. Shall we go and investigate in the next room?" "But that is Herr Jensen's room," wailed the landlord. "It is no use. He has come from there himself." "I am not so sure," said Jensen. "I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see." The only weapons of defense that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage, not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Andersen and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. "Herr Christensen," said Jensen, "will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through." The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Andersen remained outside, looking at the door. "It is number 13, you see," said the latter. "Yes, there is your door, and there is mine," said Jensen. "My room has 3 windows in the daytime," said Andersen with difficulty, suppressing a nervous laugh. "By George, so has mine," said the lawyer, turning and looking at Andersen. His back was now to the door. In that moment the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hair upon it. Andersen was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach with a cry of disgust and fright, when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Andersen hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation, and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them for the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought, and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loth to face it himself. Luckily, Andersen hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5 to 1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this, and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Andersen. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door, and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound, as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment. Then Andersen looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck it. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord, with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight, a double-bedded one." Neither Jensen nor Anderson was averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attaching to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, that portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Mag Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find lying between the beams which supported the flooring was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Sebald Behem, representing a number of sages seated round a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach, but the fly leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they submitted the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the 2, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later, as we sat in a wood near Uppsala, after a visit to the library there, where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Salthenius, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Salthenius, who was only an undergraduate when he committed that indiscretion. How did he know what company he was courting? And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That same afternoon he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him. End of number 13 by M.R. James.
A Debt of Honor, A Ghost Story by J. Sheridan LeFanu. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. A Debt of Honor, A Ghost Story by J. Sheridan LeFanu. Hush! What was that cry, so low, but yet so piercing, so strange, but yet so sorrowful? It was not the marmot upon the side of the Rigi. It was not the heron down by the lake. No, it was distinctively human. Hush! There it is again! From the churchyard, which I have just left. Not 10 minutes have elapsed since I was sitting on the low wall of the churchyard of Vegas, watching the calm glories of the moonlight illuminating with silver splendor the lake of Lucerne, but I am certain there was no one within the enclosure but myself. I am mistaken, surely. What a silence there is upon the night! Not a breath of air now to break up into 1,000 brilliant ripples the long reflection of the August moon, nor to stir the foliage of the chestnuts. Not a voice in the village, no splash of oar upon the lake. All life seems at perfect rest, and the solemn stillness that reigns about the topmost glaciers of S. Gothard has spread its mantle over the warmer world below. I must not linger. As it is, I shall have to wake up the porter to let me into the hotel. I hurry on. Not 10 paces, though, again I hear the cry. This time it sounds to me like the long, sad sob of a wearied and broken heart. Without staying to reason with myself, I quickly retrace my steps. I stumble about among the iron crosses and the graves, and displace in my confusion wreaths of immortelles and fresher flowers. A huge mausoleum stands between me and the wall upon which I had been sitting not a quarter of an hour ago. The mausoleum casts a deep shadow upon the side nearest to me. Ah, something is stirring there. I strain my eyes. The figure of a man passes slowly out of the shade and silently occupies my place upon the wall. It must have been his lips that gave out that miserable sound. What shall I do? Compassion and curiosity are strong. The man whose heart can be rent so sorely ought not to be allowed to linger here with his despair. He is gazing as I did upon the lake. I mark his profile, clear-cut and symmetrical. I catch the luster of large eyes. The face, as I can see it, seems very still and placid. I may be mistaken. He may merely be a wanderer like myself. Perhaps he heard the 3 strange cries, and has also come to seek the cause. I feel impelled to speak to him. I pass from the path by the church to the east side of the mausoleum, and so come toward him, the moon full upon his features. Great heaven, how pale his face is! "Good evening, sir. I thought myself alone here, and wondered that no other travelers had found their way to this lovely spot. Charming, is it not?" For a moment he says nothing, but his eyes are full upon me. At last he replies, "It is charming, as you say, Mr. Reginald Westcar." "You know me?" I exclaim in astonishment. "Pardon me. I can scarcely claim a personal acquaintance, but yours is the only English name entered today in the Livre des Étrangers. You are staying at the Hôtel de la Concorde, then?" An inclination of the head is all the answer vouchsafed. "May I ask," I continue, "whether you heard just now a very strange cry repeated 3 times?" A pause. The lustrous eyes seem to search me through and through. I can hardly bear their gaze. Then he replies, "I fancy I heard the echoes of some such sounds as you describe." The echoes! Is this, then, the man who gave utterance to those cries of woe? Is it possible? The face seems so passionless, but the pallor of those features bears witness to some terrible agony within. "I thought someone must be in distress," I rejoin hastily, and I hurried back to see if I could be of any service. "Very good of you," he answers coldly. "But surely such a place as this is not unaccustomed to the voice of sorrow." No doubt. My impulse was a mistaken one. But kindly meant. You will not sleep less soundly for acting on that impulse, Reginald Westcar. He rises as he speaks. He throws his cloak round him and stands motionless. I take the hint. My mysterious countryman wishes to be alone. Someone that he has loved and lost lies buried here. "Good night, sir," I say, as I move in the direction of the little chapel at the gate. Neither of us will sleep the less soundly for thinking of the perfect repose that reigns around this place. "What do you mean?" he asks. "The dead," I reply, as I stretch my hand toward the graves. "Do you not remember the lines in King Lear? 'After life's fitful fever he sleeps well.' But you have never died, Reginald Westcar. You know nothing of the sleep of death." For the 3rd time he speaks my name almost familiarly, and, I know not why, a shudder passes through me. I have no time in my turn to ask him what he means, for he strides silently away into the shadow of the church, and I, with a strange sense of oppression upon me, return to my hotel. The events which I have just related passed in vivid recollection through my mind as I travelled northward one cold November day in the year 1850 . About 6 months previously I had taken my degree at Oxford, and had since been enjoying a trip upon the Continent, and on my return to London I found a letter awaiting me from my lawyers, informing me, somewhat to my astonishment, that I had succeeded to a small estate in Cumberland. I must tell you exactly how this came about. My mother was a Miss Ringwood, and she was the youngest of 3 children. The eldest was Aldina, the second was Geoffrey, and the third, my mother Alice. Their mother, who had been a widow since my mother's birth, lived at this little place in Cumberland, which was known as the Shallows. She died shortly after my mother's marriage with my father, Captain Westcar. My Aunt Aldina and my Uncle Geoffrey, the one at that time aged 28 and the other 26, continued to reside at the Shallows. My father and mother had to go to India, where I was born, and where, when quite a child, I was left an orphan. A few months after my mother's marriage, my aunt disappeared. A few weeks after that event, and my Uncle Geoffrey dropped down dead as he was playing at cards with Mr. Marion, the proprietor of a neighboring mansion known as the Mere. A fortnight after my uncle's death, my Aunt Aldina returned to the Shallows, and never left it again till she was carried out in her coffin to her grave in the churchyard. Ever since her return from her mysterious disappearance, she maintained an impenetrable reserve. As a schoolboy I visited her twice or thrice, but these visits depressed my youthful spirits to such an extent that as I grew older I excused myself from accepting my aunt's not very pressing invitations, and at the time I am now speaking of I had not seen her for 8 or 10 years. I was rather surprised, therefore, when she bequeathed me the Shallows, which, as the surviving child, she inherited under her mother's marriage settlement. But the Shallows had always exercised a grim influence over me, and the knowledge that I was now going to it as my home oppressed me. The road seemed unusually dark, cold, and lonely. At last I passed the lodge, and 200 yards more brought me to the porch. Very soon the door was opened by an elderly female, whom I well remembered as having been my aunt's housekeeper and cook. I had pleasant recollections of her, and was glad to see her. To tell the truth, I had not anticipated my visit to my newly acquired property with any great degree of enthusiasm, but a very tolerable dinner had an inspiriting effect, and I was pleased to learn that there was a bin of old Madeira in the cellar. Naturally, I soon grew cheerful, and consequently talkative, and summoned Mrs. Balk for a little gossip. The substance of what I gathered from her rather diffusive conversation was as follows. My aunt had resided at the Shallows ever since the death of my Uncle Geoffrey, but she had maintained a silent and reserved habit, and Mrs. Balk was of opinion that she had had some great misfortune. She had persistently refused all intercourse with the people at the Mere. Squire Marion, himself a cold and taciturn man, had once or twice showed a disposition to be friendly, but she had sternly repulsed all such overtures. Mrs. Balk was of opinion that Miss Ringwood was not quite right, as she expressed it, on some topics. Especially did she seem impressed with the idea that the Mere ought to belong to her. It appeared that the Ringwoods and Marions were distant connections, that the Mere belonged in former times to a certain Sir Henry Bennet, that he was a bachelor, and that Squire Marion's father and old Mr. Ringwood were cousins of his, and that there was some doubt as to which was the real heir, that Sir Henry, who disliked old Marion, had frequently said he had set any chance of dispute at rest by bequeathing the Mere property by will to Mr. Ringwood, my mother's father, that on his death no such will could be found, and the family lawyers agreed that Mr. Marion was the legal inheritor, and my Uncle Geoffrey and his sisters must be content to take the Shallows or nothing at all. Mr. Marion was comparatively rich, and the Ringwoods poor. Consequently they were advised not to enter upon a costly lawsuit. My Aunt Aldina maintained to the last that Sir Henry had made a will, and that Mr. Marion knew it, but had destroyed or suppressed the document. I did not gather from Mrs. Balk's narrative that Miss Ringwood had any foundation for her belief, and I dismissed the notion at once as baseless. And my Uncle Geoffrey died of apoplexy, you say, Mrs. Balk? I don't say so, sir, no more than did Miss Ringwood, but they said so. Whom do you mean by they? The people at the Mere, the young doctor, a friend of Squire Marion's who was brought over from York, and the rest. He fell heavily from his chair, and his head struck against the fender. Playing at cards with Mr. Marion, I think you said. Yes, sir, he was too fond of cards, I believe, was Mr. Geoffrey. Is Mr. Marion seen much in the county? Is he hospitable? Well, sir, he goes up to London a good deal, and has some friends down from town occasionally, but he does not seem to care much about the people in the neighborhood. He has some children, Mrs. Balk? Only one daughter, sir. A sweet pretty thing she is. Her mother died when Miss Agnes was born. You have no idea, Mrs. Balk, what my Aunt Aldina's great misfortune was? Well, sir, I can't help thinking it must have been a love affair. She always hated men so much. Then why did she leave the Shallows to me, Mrs. Balk? Ah, you are laughing, sir. No doubt she considered that the Mere ought to belong to you, as the heir of the Ringwoods, and she placed you here, as near as might be to the place. In hopes that I might marry Miss Marion, eh, Mrs. Balk? You are laughing again, sir. I don't imagine she thought so much of that, as of the possibility of your discovering something about the missing will. I bade the communicative Mrs. Balk good night and retired to my bedroom, a low, wide, somber, oak-panelled chamber. I must confess that family stories had no great interest for me, living apart from them at school and college as I had done, and as I undressed I thought more of the probabilities of sport the 800 acres of wild shooting belonging to the Shallows would afford me, than of the supposed will my poor aunt had evidently worried herself about so much. Thoroughly tired after my long journey, I soon fell fast asleep amid the deep shadows of the huge four-poster I mentally resolved to chop up into firewood at an early date, and substitute for it a more modern iron bedstead. How long I had been asleep I do not know, but I suddenly started up, the echo of a long, sad cry ringing in my ears. I listened eagerly, sensitive to the slightest sound, painfully sensitive as one is only in the deep silence of the night. I heard the old-fashioned clock I had noticed on the stairs strike 3. The reverberation seemed to last a long time, then all was silent again. A dream, I muttered to myself as I lay down upon the pillow. Madeira is a heating wine, but what can I have been dreaming of? Sleep seemed to have gone altogether, and the busy mind wandered among the continental scenes I had lately visited. By and by I found myself in memory once more within the Vegas churchyard. I was satisfied. I had traced my dream to the cries that I had heard there. I turned round to sleep again. Perhaps I fell into a doze. I cannot say, but again I started up at the repetition, as it seemed outside my window, of that cry of sadness and despair. I hastily drew aside the heavy curtains of my bed. At that moment the room seemed to be illuminated with a dim, unearthly light, and I saw, gradually growing into human shape, the figure of a woman. I recognized in it my aunt, Miss Ringwood. Horror-struck, I gazed at the apparition. It advanced a little. The lips moved. I heard it distinctly say, "Reginald Westcar, the mirror belongs to you. Compel John Marion to pay the debt of honor." I fell back senseless. When next I returned to consciousness, it was when I was called in the morning. The shutters were opened, and I saw the red light of the dawning winter sun. There is a strange sympathy between the night and the mind. All one's troubles represent themselves as increased 100-fold if one wakes in the night and begins to think about them. A muscular pain becomes the certainty of an incurable internal disease, and a headache suggests incipient softening of the brain. But all these horrors are dissipated with the morning light, and the afterglow of a cold bath turns them into jokes. So it was with me on the morning after my arrival at the Shallows. I accounted most satisfactorily for all that had occurred, or seemed to have occurred, during the night, and resolved that, though the old Madeira was uncommonly good, I must be careful in future not to drink more than a couple of glasses after dinner. I need scarcely say that I said nothing to Mrs. Balk of my bad dreams, and shortly after breakfast I took my gun and went out in search of such game as I might chance to meet with. At 3 o'clock I sent the keeper home, as his capacious pockets were pretty well filled, telling him that I thought I knew the country, and should stroll back leisurely. The grey gloom of the November evening was spreading over the sky as I came upon a small plantation which I believed belonged to me. I struck straight across it. Emerging from its shadows, I found myself by a small stream and some marshy land. On the other side another small plantation. A snipe got up, I fired and tailored it. I marked the bird into this other plantation, and followed. Up got a covey of partridges. Bang, bang, one down by the side of an oak. I was about to enter this covert when a lady and gentleman emerged, and struck with the unpleasant thought that I was possibly trespassing, I at once went forward to apologize. Before I could say a word, the gentleman addressed me. "May I ask, sir, if I have given you permission to shoot over my preserves?" "I beg to express my great regret, sir," I replied as I lifted my hat in acknowledgment of the lady's presence, "that I should have trespassed upon your land. I can only plead as my excuse that I fully believed I was still upon the manor belonging to the Shallows." "Gentlemen who go out shooting ought to know the limits of their estates," he answered harshly. "The boundaries of the Shallows are well defined, nor is the area they contain so very extensive. You have no right upon this side of the stream, sir. Oblige me by returning." I merely bowed, for I was nettled by his tone, and as I turned away I noticed that the young lady whispered to him. "One moment, sir," he said. "My daughter suggests the possibility of your being the new owner of the Shallows. May I ask if this is so?" It had not occurred to me before, but I understood in a moment to whom I had been speaking, and I replied, "Yes, Mr. Marion, my name is Westcar." Such was my introduction to Mr. and Miss Marion. The proprietor of the Mere appeared to be a gentleman, but his manners were cold and reserved, and a careful observer might have remarked a perpetual restlessness in the eyes, as if they were physically incapable of regarding the same object for more than a moment. He was about 60 years of age, apparently, and though he now and again made an effort to carry himself upright, the head and shoulders soon drooped again, as if the weight of years, and, it might be, the memory of the past, were a heavy load to carry. Of Miss Marion it is sufficient to say that she was 19 or 20, and it did not need a second glance to satisfy me that her beauty was of no ordinary kind. I must hurry over the records of the next few weeks. I became a frequent visitor at the Mere. Mr. Marion's manner never became cordial, but he did not seem displeased to see me. And as to Agnes, well, she certainly was not displeased either. I think it was on Christmas Day that I suddenly discovered that I was desperately in love. Miss Marion had been for 2 or 3 days confined to her room by a bad cold, and I found myself in a great state of anxiety to see her again. I am sorry to say that my thoughts wandered a good deal when I was at church upon that festival, and I could not help thinking what ample room there was for a bridal procession up the spacious aisle. Suddenly my eyes rested upon a mural tablet inscribed "To the memory of Aldina Ringwood." Then, with a cold thrill, there came back upon me what I had almost forgotten, the dream, or whatever it was, that had occurred on the first night of the Shallows, and those strange words, "The Mere belongs to you. Compel John Marion to pay the debt of honor." Nothing but the remembrance of Agnes's sweet face availed for the time to banish the vision, the statement, and the bidding. Miss Marion was soon downstairs again. Did I flatter myself too much in thinking that she was as glad to see me as I was to see her? No, I felt sure that I did not. Then I began to reflect seriously upon my position. My fortune was small, quite enough for me, but not enough for two. And as she was heiress of the Mere and a comfortable rent roll of some 6,000 or 8,000 a year, was it not natural that Mr. Marion expected her to make what is called a good match? Still, I could not conceal from myself the fact that he evinced no objection whatever to my frequent visits at his house, nor to my taking walks with his daughter when he was unable to accompany us. One bright frosty day I had been down to the lake with Miss Marion, and had enjoyed the privilege of teaching her to skate, and on returning to the house we met Mr. Marion upon the terrace. He walked with us to the conservatory. We went in to examine the plants, and he remained outside, pacing up and down the terrace. Both Agnes and myself were strangely silent. Perhaps my tongue had found an eloquence upon the ice, which was well met by a shy thoughtfulness upon her part. But there was a lovely color upon her cheeks, and I experienced a very considerable and unusual fluttering about my heart. It happened as we were standing at the door of the conservatory, both of us silently looking away from the flowers upon the frosty view, that our eyes lighted at the same time upon Mr. Marion. He, too, was apparently regarding the prospect, when suddenly he paused and staggered back as if something unexpected met his gaze. "Oh, poor papa! I hope he is not going to have one of his fits," exclaimed Agnes. "Fits? Is he subject to such attacks?" I inquired. "Not ordinary fits," she answered hurriedly. "I hardly know how to explain them. They come upon him occasionally, and generally at this period of the year." "Shall we go to him?" I suggested. "No, you cannot help him, and he cannot bear that they should be noticed." We both watched him. His arms were stretched up above his head, and again he recoiled a step or two. I sought for an explanation in Agnes's face. "A stranger!" she exclaimed. "Who can it be?" I looked toward Mr. Marion. A tall figure of a man had come from the farther side of the house. He wore a large, loose coat and a kind of military cap upon his head. "Doubtless you are surprised to see me, John," we heard the newcomer say in a confident voice. "But I am not the devil, man, that you should greet me with such a peculiar attitude." He held out his hand and continued, "Come, don't let the warmth of old fellowship be all on one side this wintry day." We could see that Mr. Marion took the proffered right hand with his left for an instant, then seemed to shrink away, but exchanged no word of this greeting. "I don't understand this," said Agnes, and we both hurried forward. The stranger, seeing Agnes approach, lifted his cap. "Ah, your daughter, John, no doubt. I see the likeness to her lamented mother. Pray introduce me." Mr. Marion's usually pallid features had assumed a still paler hue, and he said in a low voice, "Colonel Bludyer, my daughter." Agnes barely bowed. "Charmed to renew your acquaintance, Miss Marion. When last I saw you, you were quite a baby, but your father and I are very old friends, are we not, John?" Mr. Marion vaguely nodded his head. "Well, John, you have often pressed your hospitality upon me, but till now I have never had an opportunity of availing myself of your kind offers. So I have brought my bag, and intend at last to give you the pleasure of my company for a few days." I certainly should have thought that a man of Mr. Marion's disposition would have resented such conduct as this, or at all events have given this self-invited guest a chilling welcome. Mr. Marion, however, in a confused and somewhat stammering tone, said that he was glad Colonel Bludyer had come at last, and bade his daughter to go and make the necessary arrangements. Agnes, in silent astonishment, entered the house, and then Mr. Marion turned to me hastily and bade me good-bye. In a by no means comfortable frame of mind I returned to the Shallows. The sudden advent of this miscellaneous colonel was naturally somewhat irritating to me. Not only did I regard the man as an intolerable bore, but I could not help fancying that he was something more than an old friend of Mr. Marion's. In fact, I was led to judge, by Mr. Marion's strange conduct, that this Bludyer had some power over him which might be exercised to the detriment of the Marion family, and I was convinced there was some mystery it was my business to penetrate. The following day I went up to the Mere to see if Miss Marion was desirous of renewing her skating lesson. I found the party in the billiard-room, Agnes marking for her father and the Colonel. Mr. Marion, whom I knew to be an exceptionally good player, seemed incapable of making a decent stroke. The Colonel, on the other hand, could evidently give a professional 15 and beat him easily. We all went down to the lake together. I had no chance of any quiet conversation with Agnes. The Colonel was perpetually beside us. I returned home disgusted. For 2 whole days I did not go near the Mere. On the 3rd day I went up, hoping that the horrid Colonel would be gone. It was beginning to snow when I left the Shallows at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Mrs. Balk foretold a heavy storm and bade me not be late returning. The black winter darkness in the sky deepened as I approached the Mere. I was ushered again into the billiard-room. Agnes was marking, as upon the previous occasion, but 2 days had worked a sad difference in her face. Mr. Marion hardly noticed my entrance. He was flushed and playing eagerly. The Colonel was boisterous, declaring that John had never played better 20 years ago. I relieved Agnes of the duty of marking. The snow fell in a thick layer upon the skylight, and the Colonel became seriously anxious about my return home. As I did not think he was the proper person to give me hints, I resolutely remained where I was, encouraged in my behavior by the few words I gained from Agnes, and by the looks of entreaty she gave me. I had always considered Mr. Marion to be an abstemious man, but he drank a good deal of brandy and soda during the long game of 700 up, and when he succeeded in beating the Colonel by 43, he was in roaring spirits and insisted upon my staying to dinner. Need I say that I accepted the invitation? I made such toilet as I could in a most unattainable chamber that was allotted to me, and hurried back to the drawing-room in the hope that I might get a few private words with Agnes. I was not disappointed. She, too, had hurried down, and in a few words I learned that this abominable Bludyer was paying her his coarse attentions, and with, apparently, the full consent of Mr. Marion. My indignation was unbounded. Was it possible that Mr. Marion intended to sacrifice this fair creature to that repulsive man? Mr. Marion had appeared in excellent spirits when dinner began, and the first glass or 2 of champagne made him merrier than I thought it possible for him to be. But by the time dessert was on the table he had grown silent and thoughtful, nor did he respond to the warm eulogiums the Colonel passed upon the magnum of claret which was set before us. After dinner we sat in the library. The Colonel left the room to fetch some cigars he had been loudly extolling. Then Agnes had an opportunity of whispering to me, "Look at Papa. See how strangely he sits? His hands clenching the arms of the chair, his eyes fixed upon the blazing coals. How old he seems to be tonight. His terrible fits are coming on. He is always like this toward the end of January." The Colonel's return put an end to any further confidential talk. When we separated for the night, I felt that my going to bed would be purposeless. I felt most painfully wide awake. I threw myself down upon my bed and worried myself by trying to imagine what secret there could be between Marion and Bludyer. For that a secret of some kind existed I felt certain. I tossed about till I heard the stroke of 1. A dreadful restlessness had come upon me. It seemed as if the solemn night side of life was busy waking now. But the silence and solitude of my antique chamber became too much for me. I rose from my bed and paced up and down the room. I raked up the dying embers of the fire and drew an armchair to the hearth. I fell into a doze. By and by I woke up suddenly, and I was conscious of stealthy footsteps in the passage. My sense of hearing became painfully acute. I heard the footsteps retreating down the corridor until they were lost in the distance. I cautiously opened the door, and shading the candle with my hand, looked out. There was nothing to be seen, but I felt that I could not remain quietly in my room, and closing the door behind me, I went out in search of I knew not what. The sitting rooms and bedrooms in ordinary use at the Mere were in the modern part of the house, but there was an old Elizabethan wing which I had often longed to explore, and in this strange ramble of mine I soon had reason to be satisfied that I was well within it. At the end of an oak-panelled narrow passage a door stood open, and I entered a low, sombre apartment fitted with furniture in the style of 200 years ago. There was something awfully ghostly about the look of this room. A great 4-post bedstead with heavy hangings stood in a deep recess. A round oak table and 2 high-backed chairs were in the center of the room. Suddenly, as I gazed on these things, I heard stealthy footsteps in the passage, and saw a dim light advancing. Acting on a sudden impulse, I extinguished my candle and withdrew into the shadow of the recess, watching eagerly. The footsteps came nearer. My heart seemed to stand still with expectation. They paused outside the door, for a moment really. For an age, it seemed to me. Then, to my astonishment, I saw Mr. Marion enter. He carried a small night lamp in his hand. Another glance satisfied me that he was walking in his sleep. He came straight to the round table and set down the lamp. He seated himself in one of the high-backed chairs, his vacant eyes staring at the chair opposite. Then his lips began to move quickly, as if he were addressing someone. Then he rose, went to the bureau, and seemed to take something from it. Then he sat down again. What a strange action of his hands! At first I could not understand it. Then it flashed upon me that in this dream of his he must be shuffling cards. Yes, he began to deal. Then he was playing with his adversary, his lips moving anxiously at times. A look of terrible eagerness came over the sleepwalker's countenance. With nimble fingers he dealt the cards and played. Suddenly, with a sweep of his hand, he seemed to fling the pack into the fireplace, started from his seat, grappled with his unseen adversary, raised his powerful right hand, and struck a tremendous blow. Hush! More footsteps along the passage? Am I deceived? From my concealment I watch for what is to follow. Colonel Bludyer comes in, half-dressed but wide awake. "You maniac," I hear him mutter. "I expected you were given to such tricks as these. Lucky for you, no eyes but mine have seen your abject folly. Come back to your room." Mr. Marion is still gazing, his arms lifted wildly above his head, upon the imagined foe whom he had felled to the ground. The colonel touches him on the shoulder and leads him away, leaving the lamp. My reasoning faculties had fully returned to me. I held a clue to the secret, and for Agnes's sake it must be followed up. I took the lamp away, and placed it on a table where the chamber candlestick stood, relit my own candle, and found my way back to my bedroom. The next morning, when I came down to breakfast, I found Colonel Bludyer warming himself satisfactorily at the blazing fire. I learned from him that our host was far from well, and that Miss Marion was in attendance upon her father, that the colonel was charged with all kinds of apologies to me, and good wishes for my safe return home across the snow. I thanked him for the delivery of the message, while I felt perfectly convinced that he had never been charged with it. However that might be, I never saw Mr. Marion that morning, and I started back to the Shallows through the snow. For the next 2 or 3 days the weather was very wild, but I contrived to get up to the Mere and ask after Mr. Marion. Better, I was told, but unable to see anyone. Miss Marion, too, was fatigued with nursing her father, so there was nothing to do but trudge home again. "Reginald Westcar, the Mere is yours. Compel John Marion to pay the debt of honor." Again and again these words forced themselves upon me, as I listlessly gazed out upon the white landscape. The strange scene that I had witnessed on that memorable night I had passed beneath Mr. Marion's roof had brought them back to my memory with redoubled force, and I began to think that the apparition I had seen, or dreamed of, on my first night at the Shallows had more truth in it than I had been willing to believe. 3 more days passed away, and a carter boy from the Mere brought me a note. It was Agnes's handwriting. It said, "Dear Mr. Westcar, pray come up here if you possibly can. I cannot understand what is the matter with Papa, and he wishes me to do a dreadful thing. Do come. I feel I have no friend but you. I am obliged to send this note privately." I need scarcely say that 5 minutes afterward I was plunging through the snow toward the Mere. It was already late on that dark February evening as I gained the shrubbery, and as I was pondering upon the best method of securing admittance, I became aware that the figure of a man was hurrying on some yards in front of me. At first I thought it must be one of the gardeners, but all of a sudden I stood still and my blood seemed to freeze with horror as I remarked that the figure in front of me left no trace of footmarks on the snow. My brain reeled for a moment, and I thought I should have fallen, but I recovered my nerves, and when I looked before me again it had disappeared. I pressed on eagerly. I arrived at the front door. It was wide open, and I passed through the hall to the library. I heard Agnes's voice. "No, no, Papa, you must not force me to do this. I cannot, will not marry Colonel Bludyer." "You must," answered Mr. Marion in a hoarse voice. "You must marry him and save your father from something worse than disgrace." Not feeling disposed to play the eavesdropper, I entered the room. Mr. Marion was standing at the fireplace. Agnes was crouching on the ground at his feet. I saw at once that it was no use for me to dissemble the reason of my visit, and without a word of greeting I said, "Miss Marion, I have come in obedience to your summons. If I can prevent any misfortune from falling upon you, I am ready to help you, with my life. You have guessed that I love you. If my love is returned, I am prepared to dispute my claim with any man." Agnes, with a cry of joy, rose from her knees and rushed toward me. Ah, how strong I felt as I held her in my arms. "I have my answer," I continued. "Mr. Marion, I have reason to believe that your daughter is in fear of the future you have forecast for her. I ask you to regard those fears, and to give her to me, to love and cherish as my wife." Mr. Marion covered his face with his hands, and I could hear him murmur, "Too late, too late." "No, not too late," I echoed. "What is this Bludyer to you, that you should sacrifice your daughter to a man whose very look proclaims him a villain? Nothing can compel you to such a deed, not even a debt of honor." What it was impelled me to say those last words I knew not, but they had an extraordinary effect upon Mr. Marion. He started toward me, then checked himself. His face was livid, his eyeballs glaring, and he threw up his arms in the strange manner I had already witnessed. "What is all this?" exclaimed a harsh voice behind me. "Mr. Westcar insulting Miss Marion and her father? It is time for me to interfere." And Colonel Bludyer approached me menacingly. All his jovial manner and fulsome courtesy was gone, and in his flushed face and insolent look the savage rascal was revealed. "You will interfere at your peril," I replied. "I am a younger man than you are, and my strength has not been weakened by drink and dissipation. Take care." The villain drew himself up to his full height, and though he must have been at least some 60 years of age, I felt assured that I should meet no ordinary adversary if a personal struggle should ensue. Agnes fainted, and I laid her on a sofa. "Miss Marion wants air," said the Colonel in a calmer voice. "Excuse me, Mr. Marion, if I open a window." He tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. "And now, Mr. Westcar, unless you are prepared to be sensible and make your exit by the door, I shall be under the unpleasant necessity of throwing you out of the window." The ruffian advanced toward me as he spoke. Suddenly he paused. His jaw dropped. His hair seemed literally to stand on end. His white lips quivered. He shook, as with an ague. His whole form appeared to shrink. I stared in amazement at the awful change. A strange thrill shot through me as I heard a quiet voice say, "Richard Bludyer, your grave is waiting for you. Go." The figure of a man passed between me and him. The wretched man shrank back and with a wild cry leaped from the window he had opened. All this time Mr. Marion was standing like a lifeless statue. In helpless wonder I gazed at the figure before me. I saw clearly the features in profile, and swift as lightning, my memory was carried back to the unforgotten scene in the churchyard upon the lake of Lucerne, and I recognized the white face of the young man with whom I there had spoken. "John Marion," said the voice, "this is the night upon which, a quarter of a century ago, you killed me. It is your last night on earth. You must go through the tragedy again." Mr. Marion, still statue-like, beckoned to the figure, and opened a half-concealed door which led into his study. The strange but opportune visitant seemed to motion to me with a gesture of his hand, which I felt I must obey, and I followed in this weird procession. From the study we mounted by a private staircase to a large, well-furnished bedchamber. Here we paused. Mr. Marion looked tremblingly at the stranger, and said in a low, stammering voice, "This is my room. In this room, on this night 25 years ago, you told me that you were certain Sir Henry Benet's will was in existence, and that you had made up your mind to dispute my possession to this property. You had discovered letters from Sir Henry to your father which gave you a clue to the spot where that will might be found. You, Geoffrey Ringwood, of generous and extravagant nature, offered to find the will in my presence. It was late at night, as now, all the household slept. I accepted your invitation and followed you." Mr. Marion ceased. He seemed physically unable to continue. The terrible stranger, in his low, echoing voice, replied, "Go on. Confess all." "You and I, Geoffrey, had been what the world calls friends. We had been much in London together. We were both passionately fond of cards. We had a common acquaintance, Richard Bludyer. He was present on the 2nd of February, when I lost a large sum of money to you at écarté. He hinted to me that you might possibly use these sums in instituting a lawsuit against me for the recovery of this estate. Your intimation that you knew of the existence of the will alarmed me, as it had become necessary for me to remain owner of the Mere. As I have said, I accepted your invitation, and followed you to Sir Henry Benet's room. And now I follow you again." As he said these words, Geoffrey Ringwood, or his ghost, passed silently by Mr. Marion, and led the way into the corridor. At the end of the corridor all three paused outside an oak door which I remembered well. A gesture from the leader made Mr. Marion continue. "On this threshold you told me suddenly that Bludyer was a villain, and had betrayed your sister Aldina, that she had fled with him that night, that he could never marry her, as you had reason to know he had a wife alive. You made me swear to help you in your vengeance against him. We entered the room as we enter it now." Our leader had opened the door of the room, and we were in the same chamber I had wandered to when I had slept at the Mere. The figure of Geoffrey Ringwood paused at the round table and looked at Mr. Marion, who proceeded. "You went straight to the 5th panel from the fireplace, and then touched a spring and the panel opened. You said that the will giving this property to your father and his heirs was to be found there. I was convinced that you spoke the truth. But, suddenly remembering your love of gambling, I suggested that we should play for it. You accepted at once. We searched among the papers and found the will. We placed the will upon the table and began to play. We agreed that we would play up to £10,000. Your luck was marvellous. In 2 hours the limit was reached. I owed you £10,000 and had lost the Mere. You laughed and said, 'Well, John, you have had a fair chance. At 10 o'clock this morning I shall expect you to pay me your debt of honour.' I rose, the devil of despair strong upon me. With one hand I swept the cards from the table into the fire, and with the other seized you by the throat and dealt you a blow upon the temple. You fell dead upon the floor." Need I say that as I heard this fearful narrative I recognized the actions of the sleepwalker and understood them all? "To the end," said the hollow voice. "Confess to the end." "The doctor who examined your body gave his opinion at the inquest that you had died of apoplexy caused by strong cerebral excitement. My evidence was to the effect that I believed you had lost a very large sum of money to Captain Bludyer, and that you had told me you were utterly unable to pay it. The jury found their verdict accordingly, and I was left in undisturbed possession of the Mere. But the memory of my crime haunted me as only such memories can haunt a criminal, and I became a morose and miserable man. One thing bound me to life, my daughter. When Reginald Westcar appeared upon the scene, I thought that the debt of honor would be satisfied if he married Agnes. Then Bludyer reappeared, and he told me that he knew that I had killed you. He threatened to revive the story, to exhume your body, and to say that Aldina Ringwood had told him all about the will. I could purchase his silence only by giving him my daughter, the heiress of the Mere. To this I consented. As he said these last words, Mr. Marion sunk heavily into the chair. The figure of Geoffrey Ringwood placed one ghostly hand upon his left temple, then passed silently out of the room. I started up and followed the phantom along the corridor, down the staircase, out at the front door, which still stood open, across the snow-covered lawn, into the plantation, and then it disappeared as strangely as I first had seen it, and hardly knowing whether I was mad or dreaming, I found my way back to the Shallows. For some weeks I was ill with brain fever. When I recovered, I was told that terrible things had happened at the Mere. Mr. Marion had been found dead in Sir Henry Benet's room, an effusion of blood upon the brain, the doctor said, and the body of Colonel Bludyer had been discovered in the snow in an old disused gravel pit not far from the house. A year afterward I married Agnes Marion, and if all that I had seen and heard upon that 3rd of February was not merely the invention of a fevered brain, the debt of honor was at last discharged, for I, the nephew of the murdered Geoffrey Ringwood, had become the owner of the Mere. End of A Debt of Honor, a Ghost Story. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Afterward by Edith Wharton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by annehaviland. Afterward by Edith Wharton. Chapter 1. "Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it." The assertion, laughingly flung out 6 months earlier in a bright June garden, came back to Mary Boyne with a sharp perception of its latent significance as she stood in the December dusk, waiting for the lamps to be brought into the library. The words had been spoken by their friend Alida Stair as they sat at tea on her lawn at Pangbourne in reference to the very house of which the library in question was the central, the pivotal feature. Mary Boyne and her husband, in quest of a country place in one of the southern or southwestern counties, had, on their arrival in England, carried their problem straight to Alida Stair, who had successfully solved it in her own case, but it was not until they had rejected, almost capriciously, several practical and judicious suggestions that she threw it out. "Well, there's Ling in Dorsetshire. It belongs to Hugo's cousins, and you can get it for a song." The reasons she gave for its being obtainable on these terms, its remoteness from a station, its lack of electric light, hot water pipes, and other vulgar necessities, were exactly those pleading in its favor with two romantic Americans perversely in search of the economic drawbacks which were associated, in their tradition, with unusual architectural felicities. "I should never believe I was living in an old house unless I was thoroughly uncomfortable," Ned Boyne, the more extravagant of the two, had jocosely insisted. "The least hint of convenience would make me think it had been bought out of an exhibition, with the pieces numbered and set up again." And they had proceeded to enumerate with humorous precision their various suspicions and exactions, refusing to believe that the house their cousin recommended was really Tudor till they learned it had no heating system, or that the village church was literally in the grounds, till she assured them of the deplorable uncertainty of the water supply. "It's too uncomfortable to be true," Edward Boyne had continued to exult as the avowal of each disadvantage was successfully wrung from her, but he had cut short his rhapsody to ask with a sudden relapse to distrust, "And the ghost? You've been concealing from us the fact that there is no ghost." Mary at the moment had laughed with him, yet almost with her laugh, being possessed of several sets of independent perceptions, had noted a sudden flatness of tone in Alida's answering hilarity. "Oh, Dorsetshire's full of ghosts, you know." Yes, but that won't do. I don't want to have to drive 10 miles to see someone else's ghost. I want one of my own on the premises. Is there a ghost at Ling?" His rejoinder had made Alida laugh again, and it was then that she had flung back tantalizingly, "Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it." "Never know it?" Boyne pulled her up. "And what in the world constitutes a ghost except the fact of its being known for one?" "I can't say, but that's the story." "That there's a ghost, but that nobody knows it's a ghost?" "Well, not till afterward, at any rate." "Till afterward?" "Not till long, long afterward." "But if it's once been identified as an unearthly visitant, why hasn't its signalment been handed down in the family? How has it managed to preserve its incognito?" Alida could only shake her head. Don't ask me, but it has. And then suddenly, Mary spoke up as if from some cavernous depth of divination. Suddenly, long afterward, one says to oneself, that was it? She was oddly startled at the sepulchral sound with which her question fell on the banter of the other two, and she saw the shadow of the same surprise flit across Alida's clear pupils. I suppose so. One just has to wait. Oh, hang waiting, Ned broke in. Life's too short for a ghost who can only be enjoyed in retrospect. Can't we do better than that, Mary? But it turned out that in the event they were not destined to, for within 3 months of their conversation with Mrs. Stair they were established at Ling, and the life they had yearned for to the point of planning it out in all its daily details had actually begun for them. It was to sit in the thick December dusk by just such a wide-hooded fireplace, under just such black oak rafters, with the sense that beyond the mullioned panes the downs were darkening to a deeper solitude. It was for the ultimate indulgence in such sensations that Mary Boyne had endured for nearly 14 years the soul-deadening ugliness of the Middle West, and that Boyne had ground on doggedly at his engineering, till, with a suddenness that still made her blink, the prodigious windfall of the Blue Star Mine had put them at a stroke in possession of life and the leisure to taste it. They had never for a moment meant their new state to be one of idleness, but they meant to give themselves only to harmonious activities. She had her vision of painting and gardening, against a backdrop of gray walls. He dreamed of the production of his long-planned book on the economic basis of culture, and with such absorbing work ahead, no existence could be too sequestered. They could not get far enough from the world, or plunge deep enough into the past. Dorsetshire had attracted them from the first by a semblance of remoteness out of all proportion to its geographical position, but to the Boynes it was one of the ever-recurring wonders of the whole incredibly compressed island, a nest of counties, as they put it, that for the production of its effects so little of a given quality went so far, that so few miles made a distance, and so short a distance a difference. It's that, Ned had once enthusiastically explained, that gives such depth to their effects, such relief to their least contrasts. They've been able to lay the butter so thick on every exquisite mouthful. The butter had certainly been laid on thick at Ling. The old gray house, hidden under a shoulder of the downs, had almost all the finer marks of commerce with a protracted past. The mere fact that it was neither large nor exceptional made it, to the Boynes, abound the more richly in its special sense, the sense of having been for centuries a deep, dim reservoir of life. The life had probably not been of the most vivid order. For long periods, no doubt, it had fallen as noiselessly into the past as the quiet drizzle of autumn fell, hour after hour, into the green fish pond between the yews. But these black waters of existence sometimes breed, in their sluggish depths, strange acuities of emotion, and Mary Boyne had felt from the first the occasional brush of an intenser memory. The feeling had never been stronger than on the December afternoon when, waiting in the library for the belated lamps, she rose from her seat and stood among the shadows of the hearth. Her husband had gone off after luncheon for one of his long tramps on the downs. She had noticed of late that he preferred to be unaccompanied on these occasions, and in the tried security of their personal relations had been driven to conclude that his book was bothering him, and that he needed the afternoons to turn over in solitude the problems left from the morning's work. Certainly the book was not going as smoothly as she had imagined it would, and the lines of perplexity between his eyes had never been there in his engineering days. Then he had often looked fagged to the verge of illness, but the native demon of worry had never branded his brow. Yet the few pages he had so far read to her, the introduction and a synopsis of the opening chapter, gave evidence of a firm possession of his subject and a deepening confidence in his powers. The fact threw her into deeper perplexity, since, now that he had done with business and its disturbing contingencies, the one other possible element of anxiety was eliminated. Unless it were his health, then? But physically he had gained since they had come to Dorsetshire, grown robuster, ruddier, and fresher-eyed. It was only within a week that she had felt in him the undefinable change that made her restless in his absence, and as tongue-tied in his presence as though it were she who had a secret to keep from him. The thought that there was a secret somewhere between them struck her with a sudden smart rap of wonder, and she looked about her down the dim, long room. "Can it be the house?" she mused. The room itself must have been full of secrets. They seemed to be piling themselves up as evening fell, like the layers and layers of velvet shadow drooping from the low ceiling, the dusky walls of books, the smoke-blurred sculpture of the hooded hearth. "Why, of course, the house is haunted," she reflected. The ghost, Alida's imperceptible ghost, after figuring largely in the banter of their first month or two at Ling, had been gradually discarded as too ineffectual for imaginative use. Mary had indeed, as became the tenant of a haunted house, made the customary inquiries among her few rural neighbors, but beyond a vague, "They do say so, ma'am," the villagers had nothing to impart. The elusive spectre had apparently never had sufficient identity for a legend to crystallize about it, and after a time the Boynes had laughingly set the matter down to their profit and loss account, agreeing that Ling was one of the few houses good enough in itself to dispense with supernatural enhancements. "And I suppose, poor ineffectual demon, that's why it beats its beautiful wings in vain in the void," Mary had laughingly concluded. "Or rather," Ned answered, in the same strain, "why, amid so much that's ghostly, it can never affirm its separate existence as a ghost." And thereupon their invisible housemaid had finally dropped out of their references, which were numerous enough to make them promptly unaware of the loss. Now, as she stood on the hearth, the subject of their earlier curiosity revived in her with a new sense of its meaning, a sense gradually acquired through close daily contact with the scene of the lurking mystery. It was the house itself, of course, that possessed the ghost-seeing faculty, that communed visually but secretly with its own past, and if one could only get into close enough communion with the house, one might surprise its secret, and acquire the ghost sight on one's own account. Perhaps in his long solitary hours in this very room, where she never trespassed till the afternoon, her husband had acquired it already, and was silently carrying the dread weight of whatever it had revealed to him. Mary was too well versed in the code of the spectral world not to know that one could not talk about the ghosts one saw. To do so was almost as great a breach of good breeding as to name a lady in a club. But this explanation did not really satisfy her. What, after all, except for the fun of the frisson, she reflected, could he really care for any of their old ghosts? And thence she was thrown back once more on the fundamental dilemma, the fact that one's greater or less susceptibility to spectral influences had no particular bearing on the case, since, when one did see a ghost at Ling, one did not know it. "Not till long afterward," Alida Stair had said. Well, supposing Ned had seen one when they first came, and had known only within the last week what had happened to him. More and more under the spell of the hour, she threw back her searching thoughts to the early days of their tenancy, but at first only to recall a gay confusion of unpacking, settling, arranging of books, and calling to each other from remote corners of the house as treasure after treasure of their habitation had revealed itself to them. It was in this particular connection that she presently recalled a certain soft afternoon of the previous October, when, passing from the first rapturous flurry of exploration to a detailed inspection of the old house, she had pressed, like a novel heroine, a panel that opened at her touch on a narrow flight of stairs leading to an unsuspected flat ledge of the roof which, from below, seemed to slope away on all sides too abruptly for any but practiced feet to scale. The view from this hidden coign was enchanting, and she had flown down to snatch Ned from his papers and give him the freedom of her discovery. She remembered still how, standing on the narrow ledge, he had passed his arms around her while their gaze flew to the long-tossed horizon line of the downs, and then dropped contentedly back to trace the arabesque of yew hedges about the fish pond and the shadow of the cedar on the lawn. "And now the other way," he had said, gently turning her about within his arms, and closely pressed to him she had absorbed like some long, satisfying draught the picture of the gray-walled court, the squat lions on the gates, and the lime avenue reaching up to the highroad under the downs. It was just then, while they gazed and held each other, that she had felt his arm relax and heard a sharp "hello" that made her turn to glance at him. Distinctly, yes, she now recalled she had seen, as she glanced, a shadow of anxiety, of perplexity rather, fall across his face, and following his eyes had beheld the figure of a man in loose grayish clothes, as it appeared to her, who was sauntering down the lime avenue to the court with the tentative gait of a stranger seeking his way. Her short-sighted eyes had given her but a blurred impression of slightness and grayness, with something foreign, or at least unlocal, in the cut of the figure or its garb, but her husband had apparently seen more, seen enough to make him push past her with a sharp "wait!" and dash down the twisting stairs without pausing to give her a hand for the descent. A slight tendency to dizziness obliged her, after a provisional clutch at the chimney against which they had been leaning, to follow him down more cautiously, and when she had reached the attic landing she paused again for a less definite reason, leaning over the oak banister to strain her eyes through the silence of the brown sun-flecked depths below. She lingered there till somewhere in the depths she heard the closing of a door, then, mechanically impelled, she went down the shallow flight of stairs till she reached the lower hall. The front door stood open on the mild sunlight of the court, and hall and court were empty. empty. The library door was open, too, and after listening in vain for any sound of voices within, she quickly crossed the threshold and found her husband alone, vaguely fingering the papers on his desk. He looked up, as if surprised at her precipitate entrance, but the shadow of anxiety had passed from his face, leaving it even, as she fancied, a little brighter and clearer than usual. "What was it? Who was it?" she asked. "Who?" he repeated, with the surprise still all on his side. "The man we saw coming toward the house." He seemed honestly to reflect. "The man? Why, I thought I saw Peters. I dashed after him to say a word about the stable drains, but he had disappeared before I could get down." "Disappeared? Why, he seemed to be walking so slowly when we saw him." Boyne shrugged his shoulders. "So I thought. But he must have got up steam in the interval. What do you say to our trying a scramble up Meldon Steep before sunset?" That was all. At the time, the occurrence had been less than nothing, had indeed been immediately obliterated by the magic of their first vision from Meldon Steep, a height which they had dreamed of climbing ever since they had first seen its bare spine heaving itself above the low roof of Ling. Doubtless it was the mere fact of the other incidents having occurred on the very day of their ascent to Meldon that had kept it stored away in the unconscious fold of association from which it now emerged, for in itself it had no mark of the pretentious. At the moment there could have been nothing more natural than that Ned should dash himself from the roof in pursuit of dilatory tradesmen. It was the period when they were always on the watch for one or the other of the specialists employed about the place, always lying in wait for them and dashing out at them with questions, reproaches, or reminders, and certainly in the distance the gray figure had looked like Peters. Yet now, as she reviewed the rapid scene, she felt her husband's explanation of it had been invalidated by the look of anxiety on his face. Why had the familiar appearance of Peter made him anxious? Why, after all, if it was of such prime necessity to confer with that authority on the subject of the stable drains, had the failure to find him produced such a look of relief? Mary could not say that any one of these considerations had occurred to her at the time, yet from the promptness from which they now marshaled themselves at her summons, she had a sudden sense that they must all along have been there, waiting their hour. Chapter 2. Weary with her thoughts, she moved toward the window. The library was now completely dark, and she was surprised to see how much faint light the outer world still held. As she peered out into it across the court, a figure shaped itself in the tapering perspective of bare lines. It looked a mere blot of deeper gray in the grayness, and for an instant, as it moved toward her heart thumped to the thought, "It's the ghost!" She had time in that long instant to feel suddenly that the man of whom 2 months earlier she had a brief distant vision from the roof was now, at his predestined hour, about to reveal himself as not having been Peters, and her spirit sank under the impending fear of the disclosure. But almost with the next tick of the clock, the ambiguous figure, gaining substance and character, showed itself even to her weak sight as her husband's, and she turned away to meet him as he entered, with the confession of her folly. "It's really too absurd," she laughed out from the threshold, "but I never can remember." "Remember what?" Boyne questioned as they drew together. "That when one sees the Ling ghost, one never knows it." Her hand was on his sleeve, and he kept it there, but with no response in his gesture or in the lines of his fagged, preoccupied face. "Do you think you've seen it?" he asked her, after an appreciable interval. "Why, I actually took you for it, my dear, in my mad determination to spot it." "Me? Just now?" His arm dropped away, and he turned from her with a faint echo of her laugh. "Really, dearest, you'd better give it up, if that's the best you can do." "Yes, I give it up. I give it up. Have you?" she asked, turning round on him abruptly. The parlor maid had entered with letters and a lamp, and the light struck up into Boyne's face as he bent above the tray she presented. "Have you?" Mary perversely insisted when the servant had disappeared on her errand of illumination. "Have I what?" he rejoined absently, the light bringing out the sharp stamp of worry between his brows as he turned over the letters. "Given up trying to see the ghost." Her heart beat a little at the experiment she was making. Her husband, laying his letters aside, moved away into the shadow of the hearth. "I never tried," he said, tearing open the wrapper of a newspaper. "Well, of course," Mary persisted. "The exasperating thing is that there's no use trying, since one can't be sure till so long afterward." He was unfolding the paper as if he had hardly heard her, but after a pause, during which the sheets rustled spasmodically between his hands, he lifted his head to say abruptly, "Have you any idea how long?" Mary had sunk into a low chair beside the fireplace. From her seat she looked up, startled at her husband's profile, which was darkly projected against the circle of lamplight. "No, none. Have you?" she retorted, repeating her former phrase with an added keenness of intention. Boyne crumpled the paper into a bunch and then inconsequently turned back with it toward the lamp. "Lord, no, I only meant," he explained with a faint tinge of impatience, "is there any legend, any tradition as to that?" "Not that I know of," she answered, but the impulse to add, "What makes you ask?" was checked by the reappearance of the parlor maid with tea and a second lamp. With the dispersal of shadows and the repetition of the daily domestic office, Mary Boyne felt herself less oppressed by that sense of something mutely imminent which had darkened her solitary afternoon. For a few moments she gave herself silently to the details of her task, and when she looked up from it she was struck to the point of bewilderment by the change in her husband's face. He had seated himself near the farther lamp and was absorbed in the perusal of his letters, but was it something he had found in them, or merely the shifting of her own point of view that had restored his features to their normal aspect? The longer she looked, the more definitely the change affirmed itself. The lines of painful tension had vanished, and such traces of fatigue as lingered were of the kind easily attributable to steady mental effort. He glanced up, as if drawn by her gaze, and met her eyes with a smile. "I'm dying for my tea, you know, and here's a letter for you," he said. She took the letter he held out in exchange for the cup she proffered him, and returning to her seat, broke the seal with the languid gesture of a reader whose interests are all enclosed in the circle of one cherished presence. Her next conscious motion was that of starting to her feet, the letter falling to them as she rose, while she held out to her husband a long newspaper clipping. "Ned, what's this? What does it mean?" He had risen at the same instant, almost as if hearing her cry before she uttered it, and for a perceptible space of time he and she studied each other like adversaries watching for an advantage across the space between her chair and his desk. "What's what? You fairly made me jump," Boyne said at length, moving toward her with a sudden half-exasperated laugh. The shadow of apprehension was on his face again, not now a look of fixed foreboding, but a shifting vigilance of lips and eyes that gave her the sense of his feeling himself invisibly surrounded. Her hand shook so that she could hardly give him the clipping. "This article, from the Waukesha Sentinel, that a man named Elwell has brought suit against you, that there was something wrong about the Blue Star Mine. I can't understand more than half." They continued to face each other as she spoke, and to her astonishment she saw that her words had the almost immediate effect of dissipating the strained watchfulness of his look. "Oh, that!" He glanced down the printed slip, and then folded it with the gesture of one who handles something harmless and familiar. "What's the matter with you this afternoon, Mary? I thought you'd got bad news." She stood before him with her undefinable terror subsiding slowly under the reassuring touch of his composure. "You knew about this, then? It's all right?" "Certainly I knew about it, and it's all right." "But what is it? I don't understand. What does this man accuse you of?" "Oh, pretty nearly every crime in the calendar." Boyne had tossed the clipping down and thrown himself comfortably into an armchair near the fire. "Do you want to hear the story? It's not particularly interesting, just a squabble over interest in the Blue Star." "But who is this Elwell? I don't know the name." "Oh, he's a fellow I put into it. Gave him a hand up. I told you all about him at the time." "I dare say. I must have forgotten." Vainly she strained back among her memories. "But if you helped him, why does he make this return?" "Oh, probably some shyster lawyer got a hold of him and talked him over. It's all rather technical and complicated. I thought that kind of thing bored you." His wife felt a sting of compunction. Theoretically, she deprecated the American wife's detachment from her husband's professional interests, but in practice she had always found it difficult to fix her attention on Boyne's report of the transactions in which his varied interests involved him. Besides, she had felt from the first that, in the community where the amenities of living could be obtained only at the cost of efforts as arduous as her husband's professional labors, such brief leisure as they could command should be used as an escape from immediate preoccupations, a flight to the life they always dreamed of living. Once or twice, now that this new life had actually drawn its magic circle around them, she had asked herself if she had done right, but hitherto such conjectures had been no more than the retrospective excursions of an active fancy. Now for the first time it startled her a little to find how little she knew of the material foundation on which her happiness was built. She glanced again at her husband and was reassured by the composure of his face, yet she felt the need of more definite grounds for her reassurance. "But doesn't the suit worry you? Why have you never spoken to me about it?" He answered both questions at once. "I didn't speak of it at first because it did worry me, annoyed me, rather. But it's all ancient history now. Your correspondent must have got hold of a back number of the Sentinel." She felt a quick thrill of relief. "You mean it's over? He's lost his case?" There was just a perceptible delay in Boyne's reply. "The suit's been withdrawn, that's all." But she persisted, as if to exonerate herself from the inward charge of being too easily put off. "Withdrawn because he saw he had no chance?" "Oh, he had no chance," Boyne answered. She was still struggling with a dimly felt perplexity at the back of her thought. How long ago was it withdrawn? He paused, as if with a slight return to his former uncertainty. "I've just had the news now, but I've been expecting it." "Just now? In one of your letters?" "Yes, in one of my letters." She made no answer, and was aware only after a short interval of waiting that he had risen, and strolling across the room had placed himself on the sofa at her side. She felt him, as he did so, pass an arm around her. She felt his hand seek hers and clasp it, and turning slowly, drawn by the warmth of his cheek, she met the smiling clearness of his eyes. "It's all right? It's all right?" she questioned, through the flood of her dissolving doubts, and, "I give you my word, it never was righter," he laughed back at her, holding her close. Chapter 3. One of the strangest things she was afterward to recall out of all the next day's incredible strangeness was the sudden and complete recovery of her sense of security. It was in the air when she woke in her low-ceilinged, dusky room. It accompanied her downstairs to the breakfast table, flashed out at her from the fire, and reduplicated itself brightly from the flanks of the urn and the sturdy flutings of the Georgian teapot. It was as if, in some roundabout way, all her diffused apprehensions of the previous day, with their moment of sharp concentration about the newspaper article, as if this dim questioning of the future and startled return from the past, had between them liquidated the arrears of some haunting moral obligation. If she had indeed been careless of her husband's affairs, it was, her own state seemed to prove, because her faith in him instinctively justified such carelessness, and his right to her faith had overwhelmingly affirmed itself in the very face of menace and suspicion. She had never seen him more untroubled, more naturally and unconsciously in possession of himself, than after the cross-examination to which she had subjected him. It was almost as if he had been aware of her lurking doubts, and had wanted the air cleared as much as she did. It was as clear, thank heaven, as the bright outer light that surprised her almost with a touch of summer when she issued from the house for her daily round of the gardens. She had left Boyne at his desk, indulging herself, as she passed the library door, by a last peep at his quiet face, where he bent, pipe in his mouth, above his papers, and now she had her own morning's task to perform. The task involved on such charmed winter days almost as much delighted loitering about the different quarters of her domain as if spring were already at work on shrubs and borders. There were such inexhaustible possibilities still before her, such opportunities to bring out the latent graces of the old place without a single irreverent touch of alteration, that the winter months were all too short to plan what spring and autumn executed, and her recovered sense of safety gave, on this particular morning, a peculiar zest to her progress through the sweet still place. She went first to the kitchen garden, where the espaliered pear trees drew complicated patterns on the walls, and pigeons were fluttering and preening about the silvery slated roof of their cot. There was something wrong about the piping of the hothouse, and she was expecting an authority from Dorchester who was to drive out between trains and make a diagnosis of the boiler. But when she dipped into the damp heat of the greenhouses, among the spiced scents and waxy pinks and reds of old-fashioned exotics, even the flora of Ling was in the note. She learned that the great man had not arrived, and the day being too rare to waste in an artificial atmosphere, she came out again and paced slowly along the springy turf of the bowling green to the gardens behind the house. At their farther end rose a grass terrace, commanding over the fish pond and the yew hedges a view of the long house front, with its twisted chimney stacks and the blue shadows of its roof angles, all drenched in the pale gold moisture of the air. Seen thus, across the level tracery of the yews, under the suffused mild light, it sent her, from its open windows and hospitably smoking chimneys, the look of some warm human presence, of a mind slowly ripened on a sunny wall of experience. She had never before had so deep a sense of her intimacy with it, such a conviction that its secrets were all beneficent, kept, as they said to children, for one's own good, so complete a trust in its power to gather up her life and Ned's into the harmonious pattern of the long, long story it sat there weaving in the sun. She heard steps behind her and turned, expecting to see the gardener accompanied by the engineer from Dorchester, but only one figure was in sight, that of a youngish, slightly built man who, for reasons she could not on the spot have specified, did not remotely resemble her preconceived notion of an authority on hothouse boilers. The newcomer, on seeing her, lifted his hat and passed with the air of a gentleman, perhaps a traveler, desirous of having it immediately known that his intrusion is involuntary. The local fame of Ling occasionally attracted the more intelligent sightseer, and Mary half expected to see the stranger dissemble a camera or justify his presence by producing it, but he made no gesture of any sort, and after a moment she asked, in a tone responding to the courteous deprecation of his attitude, "Is there anyone you wish to see?" "I came to see Mr. Boyne," he replied. His intonation, rather than his accent, was faintly American, and Mary, at the familiar note, looked at him more closely. The brim of his soft felt hat cast a shade on his face, which, thus obscured, wore to her short-sighted gaze a look of seriousness, as of a person arriving on business, and civilly but firmly aware of his rights. Past experience had made Mary equally sensible to such claims, but she was jealous of her husband's morning hours, and doubtful of his having given anyone a right to intrude on them. "Have you an appointment with Mr. Boyne?" she asked. He hesitated, as if unprepared for the question. "Not exactly an appointment," he replied. "Then I'm afraid, this being his working time, that he can't receive you now. Will you give me a message or come back later?" The visitor, again lifting his hat, briefly replied that he would come back later, and walked away as if to regain the front of the house. As his figure receded down the walk between the yew hedges, Mary saw him pause and look up an instant at the peaceful house front, bathed in faint winter sunshine, and it struck her, with a tardy touch of compunction, that it would have been more humane to ask if he had come from a distance, and to offer, in that case, to inquire if her husband would receive him. But as the thought occurred to her, he passed out of sight beyond a pyramidal yew, and at the same moment her attention was distracted by the approach of the gardener, attended by the bearded, pepper-and-salt figure of the boilermaker from Dorchester. The encounter with this authority led to such far-reaching issues that they resulted in his finding it expedient to ignore his train, and beguiled Mary into spending the remainder of the morning in absorbed confabulation among the greenhouses. She was startled to find, when the colloquy ended, that it was nearly luncheon time, and she half expected as she hurried back to the house to see her husband coming to meet her. But she found no one in the court but an under-gardener raking the gravel, and the hall, when she entered it, was so silent that she guessed Boyne to be still at work behind the closed door of the library. Not wishing to disturb him, she turned into the drawing-room, and there at her writing-table lost herself in renewed calculations of the outlay to which the morning's conference had committed her. The knowledge that she could permit herself such follies had not yet lost its novelty, and somehow, in contrast to the vague apprehensions of the previous days, it now seemed an element of her recovered security of the sense that, as Ned had said, things in general had never been righter. She was still luxuriating in the lavish play of figures when the parlour-maid from the threshold roused her with a dubiously worded inquiry as to the expediency of serving luncheon. It was one of their jokes that Trimmel announced luncheon as if she were divulging a state secret, and Mary, intent upon her papers, merely murmured an absent-minded assent. She felt Trimmel wavering expressively on the threshold as if in rebuke of such offhand acquiescence. Then her retreating steps sounded down the passage, and Mary, pushing away her papers, crossed the hall and went to the library door. It was still closed, and she wavered in her turn, disliking to disturb her husband, yet anxious that he should not exceed his normal measure of work. As she stood there balancing her impulses, the esoteric Trimmel returned with the announcement of luncheon, and Mary, thus impelled, opened the door and went into the library. Boyne was not at his desk, and she peered about her, expecting to discover him at the bookshelves somewhere down the length of the room, but her call brought no response, and gradually it became clear to her that he was not in the library. She turned back to the parlour-maid. "Mr. Boyne must be upstairs. Please tell him that luncheon is ready." The parlour-maid appeared to hesitate between the obvious duty of obeying orders and an equally obvious conviction of the foolishness of the injunction laid upon her. The struggle resulted in her saying doubtfully, "If you please, madam, Mr. Boyne's not upstairs." "Not in his room, are you sure?" "I'm sure, madam." Mary consulted the clock. "Where is he, then?" "He's gone out," Trimmel announced, with a superior air of one who has respectfully waited for the question that a well-ordered mind would have first propounded. Mary's previous conjecture had been right, then. Boyne must have gone to the gardens to meet her, and since she had missed him, it was clear that he had taken the shorter way to the south door instead of going around to the court. She crossed the hall to the glass portal opening directly on the yew garden, but the parlour-maid, after another moment of inner conflict, decided to bring out recklessly, "Please, madam, Mr. Boyne didn't go that way." Mary turned back. "Where did he go? And when?" "He went out to the front door. Up the drive, madam." It was a matter of principle with Trimmel never to answer more than one question at a time. "Up the drive? At this hour?" Mary went to the door herself and glanced across the court through the long tunnel of bare limes, but its perspective was as empty as when she had scanned it on entering the house. "Did Mr. Boyne leave no message?" she asked. Trimmel seemed to surrender herself to the last struggle with the forces of chaos. "No, madam. He just went out with the gentleman." "The gentleman? What gentleman?" Mary wheeled about as if to front this new factor. "The gentleman who called, madam," said Trimmel resignedly. "When did a gentleman call? Do explain yourself, Trimmel." Only the fact that Mary was very hungry and that she wanted to consult her husband about the greenhouses would have caused her to lay so unusual an injunction on her attendant, and even now she was detached enough to note in Trimmel's eye the dawning defiance of the respectful subordinate who has been pressed too hard. "I couldn't exactly say the hour, madam, because I didn't let the gentleman in," she replied, with the air of magnanimously ignoring the irregularity of her mistress's course. "You didn't let him in?" "No, madam. When the bell rang, I was dressing, and Agnes—" "Go and ask Agnes, then," Mary interjected. Trimmel still wore her look of patient magnanimity. "Agnes would not know, madam, for she had unfortunately burnt her hand in trying the wick of the new lamp from town." Trimmel, as Mary was aware, had always been opposed to the new lamp. "And so Mrs. Dockett sent the kitchen maid instead." Mary looked again at the clock. "It's after 2. Go and ask the kitchen maid if Mr. Boyne left any word." She went into luncheon without waiting, and Trimble presently brought her there the kitchen maid's statement that the gentleman had called about 1 o'clock, and that Mr. Boyne had gone out with him without leaving any message. The kitchen maid did not even know the caller's name, for he had written it on a slip of paper which he had folded and handed to her, with the injunction to deliver it at once to Mr. Boyne. Mary finished her luncheon, still wondering, and when it was over, and Trimble had brought the coffee to the drawing-room, her wonder had deepened to a faint tinge of disquietude. It was unlike Boyne to absent himself without explanation at so unwonted an hour, and the difficulty of identifying the visitor whose summons he had apparently obeyed made his disappearance the more unaccountable. Mary Boyne's experience as the wife of a busy engineer, subject to sudden calls and compelled to keep irregular hours, had trained her to the philosophic acceptance of surprises, but since Boyne's withdrawal from business he had adopted a Benedictine regularity of life, as if to make up for the dispersed and agitated years, with their stand-up lunches and dinners rattled down to the joltings of the dining car. He cultivated the last refinements of punctuality and monotony, discouraging his wife's fancy for the unexpected, and declaring that to a delicate taste there were infinite gradations of pleasure in the fixed recurrences of habit. Still, since no life can completely defend itself from the unforeseen, it was evident that all Boyne's precautions would sooner or later prove unavailable, and Mary concluded that he had cut short a tiresome visit by walking with his caller to the station, or at least accompanying him for part of the way. This conclusion relieved her from further preoccupation, and she went out herself to take up her conference with the gardener. Thence she walked to the village post office a mile or so away, and when she turned toward home, the early twilight was setting in. She had taken a footpath across the downs, and as Boyne meanwhile had probably returned from the station by the high road, there was little likelihood of their meeting on the way. She felt sure, however, of his having reached the house before her, so sure that when she entered it herself without even pausing to inquire of Trimble, she made directly for the library. But the library was still empty, and with an unwonted precision of visual memory she immediately observed that the papers on her husband's desk lay precisely as they had lain when she had gone in to call him to luncheon. Then of a sudden she was seized by a vague dread of the unknown. She closed the door behind her on entering, and as she stood alone in the long, silent, shadowy room, her dread seemed to take shape and sound, to be there audibly breathing and lurking among the shadows. Her short-sighted eyes strained through them, half discerning an actual presence, something aloof that watched and knew. In the recoil from that intangible propinquity, she threw herself suddenly on the bell-rope and gave it a desperate pull. The long, quavering summons brought Trimble in precipitately with a lamp, and Mary breathed again at this sobering reappearance of the usual. "You may bring tea if Mr. Boyne is in," she said, to justify her ring. "Very well, madam, but Mr. Boyne is not in," said Trimble, putting down the lamp. "Not in? You mean he's come back and gone out again?" "No, madam, he's never been back." The dread stirred again, and Mary knew now that it had her fast. "Not since he went out with the gentleman?" "Not since he went out with the gentleman." "But who was the gentleman?" Mary gasped out, with the sharp note of someone trying to be heard through a confusion of meaningless noises.
"That I couldn't say, madam."
Trimble, standing there by the lamp, seemed suddenly to grow less round and rosy, as though eclipsed by the same creeping shade of apprehension. "But the kitchen maid knows. Wasn't it the kitchen maid who let him in?" "She doesn't know either, madam, for he wrote his name on a folded paper." Mary, through her agitation, was aware that they were both designating the unknown visitor by a vague pronoun instead of the conventional formula which, till then, had kept their allusions within the bounds of custom, and at the same moment her mind caught at the suggestion of the folded paper. "But he must have a name. Where is the paper?" She moved to the desk and began to turn over the scattered documents that littered it. The first that caught her eye was an unfinished letter in her husband's hand, with his pen lying across it, as though dropped there at a sudden summons. "My dear Parvis." "Who is Parvis?" "I have just received your letter announcing Elwell's death, and while I suppose there is now no further risk of trouble, it might be safer—" She tossed the sheet aside and continued her search, but no folded paper was discoverable among the letters and pages of manuscript which had been swept together in a promiscuous heap as if by a hurried or a startled gesture. "But the kitchen maid saw him. Send her here," she commanded, wondering at her dullness in not thinking sooner of so simple a solution. Trimble, at the behest, vanished in a flash, as if thankful to be out of the room, and when she reappeared, conducting the agitated underling, Mary had regained her self-possession and had her questions pat. The gentleman was a stranger, yes, that she understood, but what had he said, and above all, what had he looked like? The first question was easily enough answered, for the disconcerting reason that he had said so little, had merely asked for Mr. Boyne, and scribbling something on a bit of paper, had requested that it should at once be carried in to him. "Then you don't know what he wrote? You're not sure it was his name?" The kitchen maid was not sure, but supposed it was, since he had written it in answer to her inquiry as to whom she should announce. "And when you carried the paper into Mr. Boyne, what did he say?" The kitchen maid did not think that Mr. Boyne had said anything, but she could not be sure, for just as she had handed him the paper and he was opening it, she had become aware that the visitor had followed her into the library, and she had slipped out, leaving the two gentlemen together. But then if you left them in the library, how do you know that they went out of the house? This question plunged the witness into momentary inarticulateness, from which she was rescued by Trimmel, who, by means of ingenious circumlocutions, elicited the statement that before she could cross the hall to the back passage, she had heard the gentleman behind her and had seen them go out the front door together. Then if you saw the gentleman twice, you must be able to tell me what he looked like. But with this final challenge to her powers of expression, it became clear that the limit of the kitchen maid's endurance had been reached. The obligation of going to the front door to show in a visitor was in itself so subversive to the fundamental order of things that it had thrown her faculties into hopeless disarray, and she could not stammer out, after various panting efforts at evocation, "His hat, Mum, was different, like, as you might say." Different? How different? Mary flashed out at her, her own mind in the same instant leaping back to the image left on it that morning, but temporarily lost under layers of subsequent impressions. "His hat had a wide brim, you mean? And his face was pale, a youngish face?" Mary pressed her with a white-lipped intensity of interrogation. But if the kitchen maid found any adequate answer to this challenge, it was swept away for her listener down the rushing current of her own convictions. The stranger in the garden! Why had Mary not thought of him before? She needed no one now to tell her that it was he who had called her husband and gone away with him. But who was he, and why had Boyne obeyed his call? Chapter 4. It leaped out at her suddenly like a grin out of the dark that they had often called England so little, such a confoundedly hard place to get lost in. A confoundedly hard place to get lost in. That had been her husband's phrase, and now with the whole machinery of official investigation sweeping its flashlights from shore to shore and across the dividing straits, now with Boyne's name blazing from the walls of every town and village, his portrait, how that wrung her, hawked up and down the country like the image of a hunted criminal. Now the little compact populous island, so policed, surveyed, and administered, revealed itself as a sphinx-like guardian of abysmal mysteries, staring back into his wife's anguished eyes as if with the malicious joy of knowing something they would never know. In the fortnight since Boyne's disappearance there had been no word of him, no trace of his movements. Even the usual misleading reports that raise expectancy in tortured bosoms had been few and fleeting. No one but the bewildered kitchen maid had seen him leave the house, and no one else had seen the gentleman who accompanied him. All inquiries in the neighborhood failed to elicit the memory of a stranger's presence that day in the neighborhood of Ling, and no one had met Edward Boyne, either alone or in company, in any of the neighboring villages, or on the road across the downs, or at either of the local railway stations. The sunny English noon had swallowed him as completely as if he had gone out into the Cimmerian night. Mary, while every external means of investigation was working at its highest pressure, had ransacked her husband's papers for any trace of antecedent complications, of entanglements or obligations unknown to her, that might throw a faint ray into the darkness. But if any such had existed in the background of Boyne's life, they had disappeared as completely as the slip of paper on which the visitor had written his name. There remained no possible thread of guidance except, if it were indeed an exception, the letter which Boyne had apparently been in the act of writing when he received his mysterious summons. That letter, read and reread by his wife and submitted by her to the police, yielded little enough for conjecture to feed on. "I have just heard of Elwell's death, and while I suppose there is now no further risk of trouble, it might be safer." That was all. The risk of trouble was easily explained by the newspaper clipping which had apprised Mary of the suit brought against her husband by one of his associates in the Blue Star enterprise. The only new information conveyed in the letter was the fact of its showing Boyne, when he wrote it, to be still apprehensive of the results of the suit, though he had assured his wife that it had been withdrawn, and though the letter itself declared that the plaintiff was dead. It took several weeks of exhaustive cabling to fix the identity of the parvis to whom the fragmentary communication was addressed, but even after these inquiries had shown him to be the Waukesha lawyer, no new facts concerning the Elwell suit were elicited. He appeared to have had no direct concern in it, but to have been conversant with the facts merely as an acquaintance and possible intermediary, and he declared himself unable to divine with what object Boyne intended to seek his assistance. This negative information, sole fruit of the first fortnight's feverish search, was not increased by a jot during the slow weeks that followed. Mary knew that the investigations were still being carried on, but she had a vague sense of their gradually slackening, as the actual march of time seemed to slacken. It was as though the days, flying horror-struck from the shrouded image of the one inscrutable day, gained assurance as the distance lengthened, till at last they fell back into their normal gait, and so with the human imaginations at work on the dark event. No doubt it occupied them still, but week by week and hour by hour it grew less absorbing, took up less space, was slowly but inevitably crowded out of the foreground of consciousness by the new problems perpetually bubbling up from the vaporous cauldron of human experience. Even Mary Boyne's consciousness gradually felt the same lowering of velocity. It still swayed with the incessant oscillations of conjecture, but they were slower, more rhythmical in their beat. There were moments of overwhelming lassitude when, like the victim of some poison which leaves the brain clear but holds the body motionless, she saw herself domesticated with the horror, accepting its perpetual presence as one of the fixed conditions of life. These moments lengthened into hours and days, till she passed into a phase of stolid acquiescence. She watched the familiar routine of life with the incurious eye of a savage on whom the meaningless processes of civilization make but the faintest impression. She had come to regard herself as part of the routine, a spoke of the wheel, revolving with its motion. She felt almost like the furniture of the room in which she sat, an insensate object to be dusted and pushed about with the chairs and tables. And this deepening apathy held her fast at Ling, in spite of the urgent entreaties of friends and the usual medical recommendations of change. Her friends supposed that her refusal to move was inspired by the belief that her husband would one day return to the spot from which he had vanished, and a beautiful legend grew up about this imaginary state of waiting. But in reality she had no such belief. The depths of anguish enclosing her were no longer lighted by flashes of hope. She was sure that Boyne would never come back, that he had gone out of her sight as completely as if death itself had waited that day on the threshold. She had even renounced one by one the various theories as to his disappearance which had been advanced by the press, the police, and her own agonized imagination. In sheer lassitude her mind turned from these alternatives of horror and sank back into the blank fact that he was gone. No, she would never know what had become of him. No one would ever know. But the house knew. The library in which she spent her long, lonely evenings knew. For it was here that the last scene had enacted, here that the stranger had come and spoken the word which had caused Boyne to rise and follow him. The floor she trod had felt his tread, the books on the shelves had seen his face, and there were moments when the intense consciousness of the old dusky walls seemed about to break out into some audible revelation of their secret. But the revelation never came, and she knew it would never come. Ling was not one of the garrulous old houses that betray the secrets entrusted to them. Its very legend proved that it had always been the mute accomplice, the incorruptible custodian of the mysteries it had surprised. And Mary Boyne, sitting face to face with its portentous silence, felt the futility of seeking to break it by any human means. Chapter 5. I don't say it wasn't straight, yet don't say it was straight. It was business. Mary, at the words, lifted her head with a start and looked intently at the speaker. When half an hour before a card with Mr. Parvis on it had been brought up to her, she had been immediately aware that the name had been a part of her consciousness ever since she had read it at the head of Boyne's unfinished letter. In the library she had found awaiting her a small, neutral-tinted man with a bald head and gold eyeglasses, and it sent a strange tremor through her to know that this was the person to whom her husband's last known thought had been directed. Parvis, civilly, but without vain preamble, in the manner of a man who has his watch in his hand, had set forth the object of his visit. He had run over to England on business, and finding himself in the neighborhood of Dorchester, had not wished to leave it without paying his respects to Mrs. Boyne, without asking her, if the occasion offered, what she meant to do about Bob Elwell's family. The words touched the spring of some obscure dread in Mary's bosom. Did her visitor, after all, know what Boyne had meant in his unfinished phrase? She asked for an elucidation of his question, and noticed at once that he seemed surprised at her continued ignorance of the subject. Was it possible that she really knew as little as she said? "I know nothing. You must tell me," she faltered out, and her visitor thereupon proceeded to unfold his story. It threw, even to her confused perceptions and imperfectly initiated vision, a lurid glare on the whole hazy episode of the Blue Star Mine. Her husband had made his money in that brilliant speculation at the cost of getting ahead, of someone less alert to seize the chance. The victim of his ingenuity was young Robert Elwell, who had put him on to the Blue Star scheme. Parvis, at Mary's first startled cry, had thrown her a sobering glance through his impartial glasses. Bob Elwell wasn't smart enough, that's all. If he had been, he might have turned round and served Boyne the same way. It's the kind of thing that happens every day in business. I guess it's what the scientists call the survival of the fittest, said Mr. Parvis, evidently pleased with the aptness of his analogy. Mary felt a physical shrinking from the next question she tried to frame. It was as though the words on her lips had a taste that nauseated her. But then, you accuse my husband of doing something dishonorable? Mr. Purvis surveyed the question dispassionately. Oh, no, I don't. I don't even say it wasn't straight. He glanced up and down the long lines of books as if one of them might have supplied him with the definition he sought. I don't say it wasn't straight, and yet I don't say it was straight. It was business. After all, no definition in his category could be more comprehensive than that. Mary sat staring at him with a look of terror. He seemed to her like the indifferent, implacable emissary of some dark, formless power. But Mr. Elwell's lawyers apparently did not take your view, since I suppose the suit was withdrawn by their advice. Oh, yes, they knew he hadn't a leg to stand on, technically. It was when they advised him to withdraw the suit that he got desperate. You see, he'd borrowed most of the money he lost in the Blue Star, and he was up a tree. That's why he shot himself when they told him he had no show. The horror was sweeping over Mary in great deafening waves. He shot himself? He killed himself because of that? Well, he didn't kill himself exactly. He dragged on 2 months before he died. Parvis admitted the statement as unemotionally as a gramophone grinding out its record. You mean that he tried to kill himself and failed? And tried again? Oh, he didn't have to try it again, said Parvis grimly. They sat opposite each other in silence, he swinging his eyeglass thoughtfully about his finger, she motionless, her arms stretched along her knees in an attitude of rigid tension. But if you knew all this, she began at length, hardly able to force her voice above a whisper, how is it that when I wrote you at the time of my husband's disappearance, you said you didn't understand his letter? Parvis received this without perceptible discomfiture. Why, I didn't understand it, strictly speaking. It wasn't the time to talk about it if I had. The Elwell business was settled when the suit was withdrawn. Nothing I could have told you would have helped you to find your husband. Mary continued to scrutinize him. Then why are you telling me now? Still Parvis did not hesitate. Well, to begin with, I supposed you knew more than you appear to. I mean about the circumstances of Elwell's death, and the people are talking of it now. The whole matter's been raked up again, and I thought if you didn't know, you ought to. She remained silent, and he continued. You see, it's only come out lately what a bad state Elwell's affairs were in. His wife's a proud woman, and she fought on as long as she could, going out to work and taking sewing at home. When she got too sick, something with the heart, I believe, but she had his bedridden mother to look after and the children, and she broke down under it and finally had to ask for help. That attracted attention to the case, and the papers took it up, and a subscription was started. Everybody out there liked Bob Elwell, and most of the prominent names in the place are down on the list, and people began to wonder why. Parvis broke off to fumble in an inner pocket. Here, he continued, here's an account of the whole thing from the Sentinel. A little sensational, of course, but I guess you'd better look it over. He held out a newspaper to Mary, who unfolded it slowly, remembering as she did so the evening when, in that same room, the perusal of a clipping from the Sentinel had first shaken the depths of her security. As she opened the paper, her eyes shrinking from the glaring headlines, Widow of Boyne's victim forced to appeal for aid, ran down the column of text to 2 portraits inserted in it. The first was her husband's, taken from a photograph made the year they had come to England. It was the picture of him that she liked best, the one that stood on the writing table upstairs in her bedroom. As the eyes in the photograph met hers, she felt it would be impossible to read what was said of him, and closed her lids with the sharpness of the pain. I thought if you felt disposed to put your name down, she heard Parvis continue. She opened her eyes with an effort, and they fell on the other portrait. It was that of a youngish man, slightly built, in rough clothes, with features somewhat blurred by the shadow of a projecting hat brim. Where had she seen that outline before? She stared at it confusedly, her heart hammering in her throat and ears. Then she gave a cry. This is the man! The man who came for my husband! She heard Parvis start to his feet and was dimly aware that she had slipped backward into the corner of the sofa and that he was bending above her in alarm. With an intense effort she straightened herself and reached out for the paper which she had dropped. It's the man! I should know him anywhere, she cried in a voice that sounded in her own ears like a scream. Parvis's voice seemed to come to her from far off, down endless fog-muffled windings. Mrs. Boyne, you're not very well. Shall I call somebody? Shall I get a glass of water? No, no, no! She threw herself toward him, her hand frantically clenching the newspaper. I tell you, it's the man. I know him. He spoke to me in the garden. Parvis took the journal from her, directing his glasses to the portrait. It can't be Mrs. Boyne. It's Robert Elwell. Robert Elwell. Her white stare seemed to travel into space. Then it was Robert Elwell who came for him. Came for Boyne? The day he went away? Parvis's voice dropped as hers rose. He bent over, laying a fraternal hand on her, as if to coax her gently back into her seat. Why, Elwell was dead, don't you remember? Mary sat with her eyes fixed on the picture, unconscious of what he was saying. "Don't you remember Boyne's unfinished letter to me? The one you found on his desk that day? It was written just after he heard of Elwell's death." She noticed an odd shake in Parvis's unemotional voice. "Surely you remember that," he urged her. Yes, she remembered. That was the profoundest horror of it. Elwell had died the day before her husband's disappearance, and this was Elwell's portrait, and it was the portrait of the man who had spoken to her in the garden. She lifted her head and looked slowly about the library. The library could have borne witness that it was also the portrait of the man who had come in that day to call Boyne from his unfinished letter. Through the misty surgings of her brain she heard the faint boom of half-forgotten words spoken by Alida Stair on the lawn at Pangbourne before Boyne and his wife had ever seen the house at Ling, or had imagined that they might one day live here. "This was the man who spoke to me," she repeated. She looked again at Parvis. He was trying to conceal his disturbance under what he imagined to be an expression of indulgent commiseration, but the edges of his lips were blue. "He thinks me mad, but I'm not mad," she reflected, and suddenly there flashed upon her a way of justifying her strange affirmation. She sat quiet, controlling the quiver of her lips, and waiting till she could trust her voice to keep its habitual level. Then she said, looking straight at Parvis, "Will you answer me one question, please? When was it that Robert Elwell tried to kill himself?" When? Parvis stammered. "Yes, the date. Please try to remember." She saw that he was growing still more afraid of her. "I have a reason," she insisted gently. Yes, only I can't remember. About 2 months before, I should say." "I want the date," she repeated. Parvis picked up the newspaper. "We might see here," he said, still humoring her. He ran his eyes down the page. "Here it is. Last October the—" She caught the words from him. "The 20th, wasn't it?" With a sharp look at her, he verified. "Yes, the 20th. Then you did know." "I know now." Her white stare continued to travel past him. "Sunday, the 20th. That was the day he came first." Parvis's voice was almost inaudible. "Came here first?" "Yes." "You saw him twice, then?" "Yes, twice." She breathed at him with dilated eyes. "He came first on the 20th of October. I remember the date because it was the day we went up to Malden Street for the first time." She felt a faint gasp of inward laughter at the thought that but for that she might have forgotten. Parvis continued to scrutinize her as if trying to intercept her gaze. "We saw him from the roof," she went on. "He came down the Lime Avenue toward the house. He was dressed just as he is in that picture. My husband saw him first. He was frightened and ran down ahead of me, but there was no one there. He had vanished." "Elwell had vanished?" Parvis faltered. "Yes." Their two whispers seemed to grope for each other. "I couldn't think what had happened. I see now. He tried to come then, but he wasn't dead enough. He couldn't reach us. He had to wait for 2 months, and then he came back again. And Ned went with him." She nodded at Parvis with the look of triumph of a child who has successfully worked out a difficult puzzle. But suddenly she lifted her hands with a desperate gesture, pressing them to her bursting temples. "Oh, my God! I sent him to Ned. I told him where to go. I sent him to this room," she screamed out. She felt the walls of the room rush toward her like inward falling ruins, and she heard Parvis a long way off, as if through the ruins, crying to her and struggling to get at her. But she was numb to his touch. She did not know what he was saying. Through the tumult she heard but one clear note, the voice of Alida Stair, speaking on the lawn at Pangbourne. "You won't know till afterward," it said. "You won't know till long, long afterward." End of Afterward. Recording by annehaviland.
Mademoiselle Cocotte by J. de Maupassant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by melaniebjensen. Mademoiselle Cocotte by J. de Maupassant. We were just leaving the asylum when I saw a tall, thin man in a corner of the court who kept on calling an imaginary dog. He was crying in a soft, tender voice, "Cocotte, come here, Cocotte, my beauty," and slapping his thigh as one does when calling an animal. I asked the physician, "Who is that man?" He answered, "Oh, he is not at all interesting. He is a coachman named Francois, who became insane after drowning his dog." I insisted. "Tell me his story. The most simple and humble things are often those which touch our hearts most deeply."
Here is this man's adventure, which was obtained from a friend of his, a groom. There was a family of rich bourgeois who lived in the suburb of Paris. They had a villa in the middle of a park, at the edge of the Seine. Their coachman was this Francois, a country fellow, somewhat dull, kind-hearted, simple, and easy to deceive. One evening, as he was returning home, a dog began to follow him. At first he paid no attention to it, but the creature's obstinacy at last made him turn around. He looked to see if he knew this dog. No, he had never seen it. It was a female dog, and frightfully thin. She was trotting behind him with a mournful and famished look, her tail between her legs, her ears flattened against her head, and stopping and starting whenever he did. He tried to chase this skeleton away, and cried, "Run along! Get out! Kss! Kss!" She retreated a few steps, then sat down and waited. And when the coachman started to walk again, she followed along behind him. He pretended to pick up some stones. The animal ran a little farther away, but came back again as soon as the man's back was turned. Then the coachman Francois took pity on the beast and called her. The dog approached timidly. The man patted her protruding ribs. Moved by the beast's misery, he cried, "Come, come here." Immediately she began to wag her tail, and, feeling herself taken in, adopted, she began to run along ahead of her new master. He made her a bed on the straw in the stable. Then he ran to the kitchen for some bread. When she had eaten all she could, she curled up and went to sleep. When his employers heard of this the next day, they allowed the coachman to keep the animal. It was a good beast, caressing and faithful, intelligent and gentle. Nevertheless, Francois adored Cocotte, and he kept repeating, "That beast is human. She only lacks speech." He had a magnificent red leather collar made for her, which bore these words engraved upon a copper plate, "Mademoiselle Cocotte, belonging to the Frenchman Francois." She was remarkably prolific, and 4 times a year would give birth to a batch of little animals belonging to every variety of the canine race. Francois would pick out one which he would leave her, and then he would unmercifully throw the others into the river. But soon the cook joined her complaints to those of the gardener. She would find dogs under the stove, in the ice-box, in the coal bin, and they would steal everything they came across. Finally, the master, tired of complaints, impatiently ordered Francois to get rid of Cocotte. In despair, the man tried to give her away. Nobody wanted her. Then he decided to lose her, and he gave her to a teamster who was to drop her on the other side of Paris, near Joinville-le-Pont. Cocotte returned the same day. Some decision had to be made. 5 francs was given to a train conductor to take her to Havre. He was to drop her there. 3 days later, she returned to the stable, thin, footsore, and tired out. The master took pity on her and let her stay. But other dogs were attracted as before, and one evening, when a big dinner party was on, a stuffed turkey was carried away by one of them right under the cook's nose, and she did not dare to stop him. This time, the master completely lost his temper and said angrily to Francois, "If you don't throw this beast into the water before tomorrow morning, I'll put you out. Do you hear?" The man was dumbfounded, and he returned to his room to pack his trunk, preferring to leave the place. Then he bethought himself that he could find no other situation, as long as he dragged this animal about with him. He thought of his good position, where he was well paid and well fed, and decided that a dog was really not worth all that. At last he decided to rid himself of Cocotte at daybreak. He slept badly. He arose at dawn, and taking a strong rope, went to get the dog. She stood up slowly, shook herself, stretched, and came to welcome her master. Then his courage forsook him, and he began to pet her affectionately, stroking her long ears, kissing her muzzle, and calling her tender names. But a neighboring clock struck 6. He could no longer hesitate. He opened the door, calling, "Come!" The beast wagged her tail, understanding that she was to be taken out. They reached the beach, and he chose a place where the water seemed deep. Then he knotted the rope around the leather collar and tied a heavy stone to the other end. He seized Cocotte in his arms and kissed her madly, as though he were taking leave of some human being. He held her to his breast, rocked her, and called her, "My dear little Cocotte, my sweet little Cocotte," as she grunted with pleasure. 10 times he tried to throw her into the water, and each time he lost courage. But suddenly he made up his mind, and threw her as far from him as he could. At first she tried to swim, as she did when he gave her a bath, but her head, dragged down by the stone, kept going under, and she looked at her master with wild human glances as she struggled like a drowning person. Then the front part of her body sank, while her hind legs waved wildly out of the water. Finally, those also disappeared. Then, for 5 minutes, bubbles rose to the surface as though the river were boiling, and Francois, haggard, his heart beating, thought that he saw Cocotte struggling in the mud, and, with the simplicity of a peasant, he kept saying to himself, "What does this poor beast think of me now?" He almost lost his mind. He was ill for a month, and every night he dreamed of his dog. He could feel her licking his hands and hear her barking. It was necessary to call in a physician. At last he recovered, and toward the 2nd of June his employers took him to their estate at Bessard, near Rouen. There again he was near the Seine. He began to take baths. Each morning he would go down with the groom, and they would swim across the river. One day, as they were disporting themselves in the water, Francois suddenly cried to his companion, "Look what's coming! I'm going to give you a chop!" It was an enormous, swollen corpse that was floating down with its feet sticking straight up in the air. Francois swam up to it, still joking. "Whew! It's not fresh. What a catch, old man! It isn't thin, either." He kept swimming about at a distance from the animal that was in a state of decomposition. Then, suddenly, he was silent and looked at it attentively. This time he came near enough to touch it. He looked fixedly at the collar. Then he stretched out his arm, seized the neck, swung the corpse round, and drew it up close to him, and read on the copper which had turned green, and which still stuck to the discolored leather, "Mademoiselle Cocotte, belonging to the Frenchman Francois." The dead dog had come more than 100 miles to find its master. He let out a frightful shriek, and began to swim for the beach with all his might, still howling, and as soon as he touched land, he ran away wildly, stark naked, through the country. He was insane. End of Mademoiselle Cocotte by G. de Maupassant. Recorded by melaniebjensen.